Hi, this activity is going to show you how to conduct a close reading with fictional work. For this presentation, Ms. Adkins, our English teacher at TDA, will demonstrate how to use close reading techniques.
Let's take a look at why we want to do a close reading. So before we get into the how, let's look at why. So when we do a close reading, it's going to provide us with the tools so that we can do several different things. One of them is to study the text. We need to study the text to pull information out of that text. We need to study the text, and the only way to do that, or one major way to do that, is through a close reading. We may need to look for clues in a text. By looking for clues, we can make connections to other stories that we may be reading in the same lesson, or we may be looking for other pieces of information. And that close reading will help us look for those clues. We may need to analyze a story. For example, looking at a character and why a character does a certain thing. Or we may have to analyze the story for figurative language and explain the metaphors in a story. A close reading will help us do that and will help us pull out those metaphors or that character analysis. And finally, a close reading is going to help us collect that supporting information that we need to prove our answers. So when our teachers ask us a question about why does this metaphor mean something in the story, you will have collected that information in your notes, and I'm going to very poorly write on here, but collect that information in your notes so that you can have that support at hand when you need it for your answer. Slide, I am going to show you an example of a close reading. So we're going to do a walkthrough of a close reading. But first, let's take a look at the process of close reading. So you'll notice there are, let's see, 5 basic steps that you'd want to follow when doing a close reading. The more you do this, the more comfortable it will be for you. So first things first, you got to read the story. Or if it's an article, you got to read the article. Whatever it is, you have to read it. I would suggest reading through so that you know, maybe you could find any vocabulary words that you don't quite know. Read through to see how long it is. Read through to identify the structure of it. Is it in paragraphs? Is it a poem? Does the poem rhyme? Just kind of read through and just get a general idea. Next thing, you want to read it again. And I'm just going to be real with you guys. You're going to have to read literature or read articles for study more than once. And it's perfectly okay. Lots of scholars read text more than once. Because each time that you read it, I want you to look at something a little bit different. Maybe the first time you go through a paragraph or the first time you go through a chapter, read it and analyze it for characters. The next time, read it and analyze it for vocabulary. Maybe again, read it and see if there's any deeper meaning in the metaphors. So get over the habit or get over the idea that you can just read something once and fully understand it. Probably not going to happen. You are going to have to read it more than once. Let's move on to the next steps, which is annotating. So that would be taking notes. Annotate is just a fancy way of saying take notes on the events of the story. So as you go through and read it a second time or a third time or maybe even the fourth time, you should be taking notes. Taking notes is one way that you can collect that evidence. Remember, we talked about why on the previous slide. Well, in order to collect that evidence that you need for your writings or about the story, the way to do that is by taking notes. So what do we look for when we take notes? So I've added a few things. This is not everything. This is just some of the basic stuff that you can take notes on to get you started. So one would be the events of the story. So make a list of everything that's going on in the story, especially something that you don't understand. Put a big question mark by it in your notes, but still have that record of events. Make note of different characters as they appear in the story. Sometimes you'll be able to easily relate to a character. Sometimes there's going to be a lot of characters and maybe they have similar sounding names, but it will help to have a list of who's who in the story. Take notes on the setting. Sometimes authors make the setting a big part of the story, so you want to have information on the setting. When did this take place? Where did it take place? So those are some key bits of information about the setting. Make note of any vocabulary. It's going to be hard to understand the story if there's some vocabulary words in there that you are not familiar with. So in your notes, as you annotate, make note of any vocabulary words or words that are not familiar to you. Your notes would be a great place to keep track of that vocabulary. Also, as we mentioned before, keep track of the events. That's why I put a little calendar in there. Just what are the major happenings of the story? Keep track of that information in your notes. The notes serve as just one place where you have all this awesome information about the story. After you read through and you take notes on the characters, the setting, and so forth, next, add another layer to your notes. And this is where you put in your own reactions to the story of what's going on. So what are your thoughts about how a character behaved or how a character is described? Or is this a setting that you can relate to? Or is it a setting, let's say it's a futuristic setting. Can you find any similarity, or do you have any questions that pop up in your mind? So that's why I've got the little thinking emoji over here. But annotate on your reactions. So part of the notes is recording, what happened, the who, the what, the where. But another part is your reaction to that. As you go through and read again, also comment on the literary elements. I'll talk about this on another slide, but this would be things such as metaphors, personifications, which I got the little cat emoji over here as a little example of a personification here. So look at the different literary elements that are coming through, especially if this is a fictional text. And finally, take a moment, maybe after each reading, or maybe after each, chapter, or even if you have to go after every page or after every 5 paragraphs, take a moment and summarize what you've just read. It helps if you can put it into your own words. If you are unable to summarize what you just read or summarize your reactions in your own words, chances are that's a good indicator that says, wait a minute, maybe I did not understand this like I thought I did. So maybe I need to go back and read it one more time until I can understand it. But if you have all of these elements, especially as you build your notes, you will have a great collection of evidence that you can send to your teacher for discussion and that you can use to help support any questions that you are asked in the course. What a close reading looks like. I have selected a great story by Agatha Christie. She's a very popular mystery writer. The story, it's The Mysterious Affair at Styles, was first published in 1920. The story takes place in Essex, which is outside of London. This is also in the public domain, which means I can post it here copyright free. It's a very challenging text, but that works in our favor as there's lots to comment on for this demonstration. So why am I telling you all this information? The background information is helpful to know when it comes to doing a close reading. So if you have a chance, take a moment and see what you can find out about the text that you are reading. On the first reading, I wanted to figure out the who, the what, the where, what was going on. So to save time, I went through and I circled a few of the characters. So we have I, which I do have a question about that, so I'm going to add a little question mark there. We have Poirot. He's another character name. That's actually her major detective that is in several of her stories. We have Cavendish. Not sure who John Cavendish is yet, other than a friend. We have Mrs. Cavendish, which I think is John's mom. We also marked up the locations, and I put those in a different color to separate the characters and the locations. So in my notes, I have a way to keep all this information straight. So we have it's at Styles, which is in Essex, as we said, is outside of London. We have the country place called Styles Court. So we're getting a sense of where this story takes place. We know the when, because this was published in about 1920, and we know that Agatha Christie published in her own time. So her stories took place in the time that they were published. So we're looking at about 1920 here. When you are annotating a text, I encourage you to use different colors if possible, whether it's on note paper or whether you're typing in a Word document or whether you're marking up screenshots. Use different colors to make the information stand out to you. Let me show you what you should be asking yourself. Remember, one of the goals of a close reading is to question your reactions to the text. So if I go through and I'm reading this first paragraph, we have intense interest aroused in public by what was known as the time as the Styles case, has now somewhat subsided. Nevertheless, in view of the worldwide notoriety which attended it, I have been asked both by my friend Poirot and the family themselves to write an account of the whole story. So, great opening lines there. It gives us lots of questions about what is going on. So what is the Styles case? Apparently it was some big to-do. So my question as I went through my first reading, I thought about who is this I? Who is the I that's right here? So we could, just by reading the first paragraph, we could say, well, the I could be Agatha Christie herself, because, as a storyteller is telling this story. Or the I could be the storyteller. So another fictional character that the story just happens to be told through first-person point of view. So when you're going through and asking yourselves questions, think about how point of view plays into this, and don't be shy about asking questions. What point of view is this? Who is I? How does he know Poirot? How does he know this family? All of that hopefully will be revealed later on. But if you are asking yourself questions and jotting these questions down in your story, in your notes, that should give you some structure to collecting this evidence and really looking closely at the text to find those answers. Let me go on and talk about vocabulary for a moment. So as we are doing a close reading, as I've said before, you want to understand the vocabulary so you can figure out what is going on. Because if you're having a hard time understanding the vocabulary, it's very easy to miss some critical details. So let's take a look at this. Let's see, it'd be the third paragraph down here. All right. Now, a couple vocabulary words in here, and I want to connect it to some background information that I gave you earlier. So let me see if I can mark some words here. So we have, I have been invalided. That's a word we don't hear anymore. Home from the front. Notice front is capitalized. I wonder if that has a significance. And after spending some months in a rather depressing convalescent home, was given a month's sick leave. All right, so whoever this I is, we're still not exactly sure. This I person doesn't have a name. They've had something going on with them, so we need to figure out the meanings of some of these words. I would recommend looking up some of those words. So if you look up convalescent home, if you look up invalid, that's a hard word to say because it's not one that we use very much. So it reminds us of someone that's an invalid, someone who cannot move around on their own very easily. If we put that together, so we know someone is injured in some way, the speaker is injured in some way. We put this together by the capitalization of the front. All right, remember the time period of this story. This is 1920, set in England. If you look at history, what was going on at that time, that is right after World War I, where there was a huge number of injured soldiers who came home after the war. And a lot of them, just because battlefield medicine was not what it is today, a lot of them had very serious injuries and lived with those injuries for several years, pretty much the rest of their lives. So right after the war had ended, this is just a few years after the war had ended, He spent time in a convalescent home, but it was rather depressing, so he wanted to get out. So we can assume that this person is someone who was injured in the war. And I'm guessing that would knock out Agatha Christie herself as the narrator. This I becomes someone that is a soldier. So I'm just going to abbreviate that SOL right here. So we know that he's a soldier. We're using clues from the vocabulary. We're using clues from the context of the story. We're asking ourselves questions, and we're trying to answer those questions as we read. I know this is a long slide. Bear with me, students. Bear with me. This is important information, and I want to make sure I explain it so that you guys can understand it. Feel free to comment on here if you have any additional questions about this process or about this story. Let me show you one other aspect that you can look at when you are doing a close reading. Let's take a look at these paragraphs right here. So before we get to this, we find out that he knows this John Cavendish. Agatha Christie goes into a description about their ages, briefly how they're connected to each other, and then where they're staying. So he's staying at Styles, which is his mother's place. So he's hanging out at this acquaintance's mom's house. So then he says, let's see, he added, so this is John Cavendish. He says, "The mater will be delighted to see you again." Well, that's a word we don't quite use every day today. It sounds a bit like a foreign word, maybe one that's not directly English. Let's look at context clues and see if we can figure this out. It says, "The mater will be delighted to see you again after all those years," he added. And then I asked, "Your mother keeps well." So by using context, we can kind of figure out, oh, mater is another word for mother in here. So use context clues to help figure out what is going on in a story. The last thing that I want you to do when you do a close reading is do a type of summary. Now, depending on what text you're reading and depending on how easy it is or how difficult it is for you, you may want to space out how often you do a summary. So for a story like this that may have a lot of challenging vocabulary or may have a lot of characters right at the beginning that we're still trying to get figured out and straightened out and who's who and how they know each other, you may want to do just a quick one-sentence summary at the end of each page. So after every couple paragraphs or at the end of the page, go ahead and write a summary. If you are unable to summarize the events of what is going on, that is an indicator, wait a minute, I need to go back and read this again. I need to go in and take more notes. I need to ask more questions. I need to contact my teachers to help me out. So that summary is going to be a good indicator. So how could we summarize all the events in here? Well, knowing what we know, because we did that close reading and we pulled out bits of information from the text, we can say our speaker, or the story is told from a soldier's point of view. He's staying with a friend's mother, and he's relating the events of the Styles case, a very famous case that we don't know anything about, but apparently he is, so he's going to tell us that story. In your Plato lesson, it does talk about doing a close reading. You are also asked to do a close reading for several sections of popular texts. You are asked to look at figurative language. The lesson does give a brief overview, so maybe use your annotating skills, use your close reading skills to practice with a close reading on your lesson. I know the lesson does give definitions and some examples of these and other figurative language terms. So if you want to go back to the lesson, you can. I have also added a very brief collection of figurative language definitions, at least to get you started from vocabulary.com. So if you click on the link over here in the corner, it will open up a new link that has a collection of not only these terms, but also many, many others that you're likely to encounter. An author will sometimes use figurative language, whether it be flashbacks, whether it be point of view, which we see in our story. Our story starts out from first-person point of view, and it does seem to be like a flashback. They're kind of going back and recapping the events of what happens. Symbols are very big. Imagery is very big in a lot of stories. There's lots of elements of figurative language that can appear. An author puts those in intentionally. So don't ignore them. Make note of them. If you are confused about them, write down in your notes, I am confused about this metaphor. I have not figured it out yet. So it's okay. That's part of the process of documenting your reactions and diving into that close reading, is showing what you know as well as what you don't know. But know that you can check this link if you want to learn a little bit more about what those figurative language elements are.
Okay, so I'd like to take this time to thank Ms. Adkins. She's a teacher here at TDA, for reviewing the close reading techniques using fictional work. And now it'll be time for you to try the techniques as you read the short story 11. Let's move on.